Hey guys, and welcome to the next video in our series on Rome. And this one we're going to be talking about Roman economy and society. So Roman economy, it was predominantly agricultural based. Rome was able to support a much larger population than Greece because of its agricultural capabilities. But most of its agriculture was based on large-scale agriculture from the latifundia. Right? They were the equivalent of the plantations, and they were also heavily reliant on slave labor. But because they had such extensive trade, and this Roman agriculture was all throughout the empire, it allowed commercial agriculture, which is different from subsistence agriculture. You're able to focus on cash crops. Surpluses allow you to do that as well, having agricultural surpluses. It also led to regional specialization. I'll show you guys a map in a second, but Romans, that were running latifundias in Italy said, well, we don't need to grow certain things because we can import those from North Africa or Greece or Gaul or places like that. So it allowed different regions of the empire to specialize in different crops and natural resources. Now, Roman trade, as you can see, was very, very extensive. Okay, it shows you the extent of the Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd century, 180 AD, the old saying for CE. And it just really shows you kind of the massive network all around the Mediterranean, the Mare Nostrum, as it was called, our sea. So here you got Rome right in the middle of it. And if you go up around Gaul, these things such as iron, grapes, lead, you see gold and silver and tin. Precious metals was a big thing from the Iberian Peninsula. North Africa, that was kind of like their breadbasket. You see a lot of wheat. See olives coming from Greece. Remember we talked about that in the last chapter. Wheat also coming from Egypt, from Alexandria, around the Nile Basin. Iron and silver and whatnot coming from Anatolia as well. You got some, beyond this, in the Silk Road, you got spice and silk and flaxseed that would come all the way from the Far East as well. Some more exotic things like exotic animals and ivory from gold farther south in Africa. So it really was a very, very extensive trade network, and it was facilitated by the Roman road network. You were able to trade from here Londinium, so tin could come up from Londinium and make its way down to Rome and vice versa. And it led to this really dominance of the Mediterranean world by the Romans. The Latin was spoken in all of these ports because, the same way that English has become kind of like the dominant language of trade because of American dominance, the same thing with Latin and Roman dominance throughout this part of the world. And a lot of it was really just because of trade. So very, very diverse trade network and very, very extensive trade network as well. Now, urban centers. Trade leads to urbanization, and at the heart of this was the imperial city, Rome itself. At its height, in the 1st and 2nd century CE, it had, some estimates think close to 1 million people. It was the largest city in the world, and it was very densely compacted. You notice that a lot of curving roads to it. It wasn't a very well-designed city because it just kind of built up and expanded as it grew and grew. But that was common among ancient cities. You see some of the major features such as the Circus Maximus and the Colosseum, major aqueducts that went through, and it was a big city. Had a lot of the issues that come with large cities, crime, disease, and so forth, but still it was looked at as being the heart of the empire and the jewel of the empire at the same time. The saying, all roads lead to Rome, literally was true. Now, it wasn't the only urban center for it as well. You notice that major cities in black, there weren't that many of them. Right? You got Rome and Naples, you've got Athens, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, more still in the eastern. Remember we said the eastern Mediterranean was the more urbanized. But with all the road networks going all the way up from Britain down into North Africa, you got a lot of towns. So while you didn't necessarily have huge urban centers at all times throughout Roman history, you did have a lot of growth. These people, even up in what eventually would be England and France and Germany, they weren't living kind of out in the wilderness so much anymore. It did lead to the growth of larger settlements. And you notice Rome literally right in the middle of everything right there. Okay, so trade, this is a common theme that we've talked about an awful lot. It leads to urbanization. It's going to lead to trade networks developing. It's going to lead to people getting settled along trade routes in order to make money. And there were common elements that you would see in Roman cities. It didn't matter whether you were talking about Rome itself or cities through anywhere in the empire. You had your aqueducts, Roman engineering for aqueducts and sewers as well. That was common in a lot of them. The Roman baths, another one. Romans loved their public bathhouses, and you would see those in Germania, you would see those in Judea, you would see them in Gaul and Iberia and all throughout the empire. Urban attractions, and again, maybe these weren't quite as big as the main ones in Rome, but you would still see similar things. The circuses. Circuses were large racetracks where they would have chariot races. The Circus Maximus. This is an artistic rendition. The outline of it is still there in Rome, but the construct of it itself has disappeared over the centuries. But this was huge. It seated 250,000 people. That's twice as big as our largest football stadiums. You have the Colosseum. Most of this obviously is still showing from this photograph. It's still standing, but at its height, it seated tens of thousands of people, and you'd have the gladiator games, and they would flood it was so kind of well constructed they could flood the floor in order to have reenactments of naval battles. They'd have fights against wild animals and things like that. And it was all about spectacle. It was all about size. The Romans went big. Their architecture was very much influenced by the Greeks, but they went bigger and grander with it. All right, now Roman society, very patriarchal. You had this thing in Roman society known as the pater familias. Pater here, Roman for father, right? That's the root for patriarchal. And while it wasn't necessarily enacted, it wasn't that every Roman father ruled his family tyrannically, law did back them up that they could have total control over their family to the point of life and death. If they felt dishonored by their, wives or children, Roman law would allow them to kill them. But as I said, that very, very rarely happened. And the laws that, in order to enforce patriarchal society in Rome, they were not always enforced. By the 2nd and 3rd century CE, you did have women that could inherit property and run businesses and things like that, just because, men didn't really get that worked up about it. But if a man wanted to make a case of it, the law did back him up because of the whole notion of pater familias. Now, within Rome, because it was so big, you did have high rates of poverty. You had a growing wealth disparity between the rich and poor. And the unemployed, a lot of them started to sign up for these private armies for guys like Marius and Sulla and eventually Caesar. So that ended up being a bad thing for the Republic. It also led to this thing called bread and circuses, even into the imperial days. It was thought that to keep the people happy, just give them the basics. Bread, give them, keep food in their belly, and circuses, games of a more spectacle like the gladiator games. It was meant to distract them from the drudgery of their day-to-day lives. If they could go and watch people kill themselves, and if they were just given bread, they wouldn't get so worked up about not having a good job. Slavery was very, very common throughout the Roman Empire. They think as much as 1/3 of the Roman Empire's population at one time was made up of slaves. And rural slaves working on the latifundias, they did have it very, very tough. They lived under very harsh conditions, and this gave rise to some large-scale slave revolts. The most famous one being, the slave rebellion led by Spartacus in 73 BCE, which has been popularized in movies and television shows and so forth. But that actually happened. That was based in reality, and the Roman legions had to be called in to put it down. Urban slaves had it better, generally speaking, than slaves working out in the fields, and it was common that they would be freed on their master's death. But while they were under their master's control, they were chattel, they were property, and the masters could have total control over their lives. Now, Roman culture. Remember, down on the bottom of the peninsula, you had an awful lot of Greek colonies, and this really showed in the heavy Greek influence in Roman society and culture. With their religion. The Greeks, the deity that the Greeks called Zeus, the Romans kind of just translated that to suit their own needs, and they renamed him as Jupiter. So it wasn't that they totally copied everything about their religion from the Greeks, but it was just a classic example of the heavy influence that they had. Also, Greek culture was still considered to be, kind of like the high point to them. Remember, Greek culture is the foundation of Western civilization. So the Greeks were often used as tutors among the patrician families. Now, Stoicism, remember, that was a Hellenistic philosophy that became very popular throughout the Hellenistic world. in the later centuries of BCE. And this became very popular in the Roman world due to the writings of Cicero. Cicero's big thing was, creating a universal moral standard, the pursuit of justice. And this was big, this moral standard and civic duty was big for the Romans, kind of service to the state and so forth. Salvation religions started to pop up also at this point. Now, these are all predecessors to Christianity. Remember, the majority of ancient religions did not talk about salvation. Think back to Gilgamesh. Everybody who died kind of went to the same place. But eventually you start to have what were looked at as cults, but these religious movements that started to give more hope for salvation. An example being Mithraism. Mithras was a deity, came from Zoroastrianism, from the old Persian Empire, and it was picked up by Roman soldiers as they conquered through the Hellenistic world. And it became big for the military because of its emphasis put on courage and strength and so forth. And lastly, you have, there's a picture of Mithras there. And lastly, you have the worship of the emperor. Starting with Augustus, remember the title Augustus that Octavian took, was meant to have divine connotation. The emperor eventually was worshipped as a god. The Caesar was given total devotion. And that kind of in of itself became almost like a religious cult. And we'll talk about how that, in the next video, we'll talk about how that would become particularly problematic for people living in the Roman province of Judea.